Okay, we might get going, I think. So good morning, everybody. Thanks for coming along today. This is the second day of our Nations of Towns event. Just to introduce myself, my name's Philip Crowe. I'm co-director of the Centre for Irish Towns, along with Orla Murphy, who you heard from yesterday, and you heard from me yesterday. I'm a lecturer in UCD in climate responsive design in the Schools of Architecture, Planning and Environmental Policy and the School of Civil Engineering. I'm also a graduate of the University of Edinburgh and at the University of Glasgow in architecture and carbon management, respectively. So I'm particularly invested in this collaboration. So I'm going to just share my screen. And what I'm sharing is the Miro board that we're going to be using later in the workshop. And I just wanted to build on what Steve said yesterday about what this collaboration is about. So it's obviously a very new collaboration between the Centre for Irish Towns in UCD, which itself is new, and the Edinburgh Futures Institute at the University of Edinburgh. We think that the collaboration has huge potential. We're very excited about it, and there's potentially quite a lot of support out there for this collaboration at the university level, but also at the level of local government and the level of national government. There are quite interesting agreements and meetings happening at a very high level, and we see ourselves hopefully as being part of that. So if I just move down the Miro board here, just to show you where we are at with the well, what is this collaboration? And Steve talked about this yesterday. This is a diagram that we've been using basically as a working diagram to try and figure out how we move forward. And we see the collaboration as having three pillars, as it were. One is about sharing knowledge and experience. So obviously the talks yesterday, sharing knowledge about policy and experience on projects is relevant to that. Another pillar is enriching student experiences. So we're really hoping that across all disciplines that we are able to engage with one another, that the two universities engage in terms of student experiences. So that might be studio projects in architecture or urban planning, but it could also be thesis projects, etc., in any number of disciplines. And then the third pillar is creating new research opportunities. And I suppose in many ways, that's the one that we would be focusing on today. But equally, there may be opportunities today to discover other areas for shared knowledge and experience and other areas for enriching student experiences. So there's obviously huge potential and it's very broad and very wide. And what we're really wanting to do today is to try and find some common areas points of connection that we can work on over the next year so that we have some tangible projects moving forward. So moving from a very big picture down to something manageable and tangible. So today we are going to, the main part of today is going to be a workshop, and I'm just scanning out to show you the main panel, the main frame for the workshop. So you can see that this is not a Black Friday event. This is a Rainbow Friday event. You will not be asked to make any purchases whatsoever, and you can ignore your inbox for the next 2.5 hours. The first part of today, we are going to learn about funding opportunities between Scotland and Ireland for research projects and different activities in a post-Brexit context. Obviously, things have changed dramatically in the past year. They are still slightly uncertain, particularly with the largest funding opportunity, which is Horizon Europe, which apparently is not signed. So Caitriona is going to introduce us to various funding opportunities, and Caitriona has been working with Anna Votsi in the University of Edinburgh, and thank you to Anna for all of that input. So we're going to look at that first, and then we're going to go into a workshop where we're going to workshop ideas for projects that the collaboration can focus on. And I will explain how the workshop is going to work after Caitriona has spoken. If I just zoom in now on the program for today, so we have two sessions. The first session starting hopefully at about 10 o'clock. I'm just looking at my clock to say I'm still within my 10 minutes. So the first session starting at 10 o'clock and the second session starting at 11. And we will have very quick reporting back to the wider group. The workshop is going to build on our workshop in March. So whenever you get into the Miro board, and I see a few people are in already, you can pan over to the workshop that we had last March. Seems like quite a while ago at this stage. So if I zoom in here, you see what we did last March, and I know that a lot of people that were there in March are not here today, and people here today that were not there in March. We focused on individuals really and understanding who was in the group. So we were asking things about common challenges, how the challenges might be addressed, and what are the benefits of this collaboration. And we've taken a lot of that material and directly inputted it into this workshop today. But today is not so much about individuals as it is about trying to come together and form some sort of connections and some sort of energy around certain ideas. So it's primarily about making those connections and making cross-border conversations about challenges facing towns. And it's also about generating collaborative activities that we can focus on going forward. And they could be research funding projects, they could be knowledge sharing events, or they could be student projects. So it's any idea for the collaboration. So the outcome of today is hopefully that some connections will be made and some ideas produced. And we could identify topics of common interest. So I just pan back to the workshop for today. So hopefully we'll have some outline narratives of projects that we can go forward with. So I think I'll stop sharing. I'm going to come back to this board just before we go into the workshop. We will go into breakout rooms that you have already selected. And I'm going to hand over now to Caitriona, who has very kindly put a lot of work into putting together some very exciting funding opportunities. And I'll hand over to you now, Caitriona.
Thanks, Philip. So my name is Caitriona, as Secretary of Devery, as Philip just said, and I'm going to give a short presentation on research funding in relation to nations of towns and the kinds of cross-border, collaborative and interdisciplinary project ideas we hope might emerge from the breakout sessions later. So I'm the research manager in the UC's Earth Institute, and my role is generally to look out for research funding opportunities. So most of the funding I've included here, as Philip said, will be related to research funding, with a little bit on some other opportunities, but primarily research funding. And again, I would also just say thanks to Anna Vozzi in the Edinburgh Futures Institute, who was really useful or really helpful in filling me in on the UK funding side of things. So first up, I'll just give you an outline of what I'll be talking about today. I've broken down the opportunities into different categories. They are a bit arbitrary and they kind of overlap, so they might not make total sense, but they're roughly, it's kind of funding that explicitly funds cross-border research initially is what I look at, and then go on to funding that might only look at one country, might only fund one country, which could be part of a parallel funding approach. And then European funding for networks, something on early career researcher funding, and then finally a little bit just to mention internal funding opportunities through both institutions and some of those community oriented funding opportunities. So there's a range of opportunities here from small to big. Hopefully this afternoon we can start thinking about the scale of what might work for particular topics, and then at some point in the future we can look at mapping that onto funding options. So I won't get into too much detail on the calls because we don't have time and it's also a bit tedious. So I think it's more just to give you an overview of what's on offer, and the slides are going to be available afterwards through the Miro board. So if you want any of the details or links or anything, they'll be all within that. So first up, it's kind of cross-border, get straight to straight to the chase. Cross-border project funding for sort of bigger research projects. The obvious source of funding for any of these kind of large-scale long-term projects would be through UK Research Council. UK Research Council is through the Arts and Humanities Research Council or the Economic and Social Research Council. Both of them have what they're called standard grants, which are kind of rolling. They have a rolling deadline. They're always open. They fund up to £1 million for projects of up to 5 years. The AHRC does fund kind of smaller scale projects, but the ESRC, has to be at least 350,000. They're kind of standard research projects. They have to be sort of the principal investigator, the lead researcher has to be from either AHSS or economic or social sciences discipline, but they do facilitate interdisciplinary projects as well. So if it's led by, Arts and Humanities Research Council has to be led by an Arts and Humanities researcher, but it can bring in other disciplines as well. So that's suitable. And also the primary aspect it's relevant here is that it does fund international co-investigators. So it could fund Irish researcher costs as well as kind of all the other standard research costs. So if you were going up to a large scale project of about $1 million, you're talking about building a team of researchers, maybe with postdocs, with buyout for some of the academics in either or both institutions, PhD students, research assistants. So that would be quite a significant scale of project. So beyond that, there are also some schemes which explicitly fund, within the call is explicit that they want to fund a UK-Ireland collaboration, not just any kind of international collaboration. So there's a call that's also a rolling call open at the moment that funds up to €500,000 for projects with a duration of up to 5 years. That one also funds salary costs and project costs in both countries. It's probably more limited in scope, but it would fund engineering type projects. So that's potentially something that could be relevant to nations of towns. If possibly we have to check if it's possible to bring in other disciplines, but I think it's primarily would be definitely engineering led. There's also a call that recently closed, the UK-Ireland into collaboration in digital humanities. It could be a little bit tangential in terms of, I'm not sure if we have anyone here that works on digital humanities, but two of the strands that did seem relevant that are digital humanities and social innovation, or in relation to cultural heritage. So again, it's just as an example of a type of UK-Ireland where both research councils are involved and both councils kind of both contribute to the call. So those we just have to keep an eye out for those types of calls, because they do seem to come up with specific focus areas every so often. Then I'll just briefly talk about there's another couple of grants that do facilitate international researcher team membership, but they don't fund the salary costs of those international team members. So the Irish Research Council's Collaborative Alliances for Societal Challenges call is a very popular call in Ireland, and it funds research that addresses societal challenges that are within national, European and global policy challenges. So obviously European policies, national policies, and things like Agenda 2030. So that does facilitate does allow team membership from international organizations, but only funds the kind of collaboration costs. So travel would be included, and any other kind of costs that are about facilitating that collaboration. And those grants are for up to 220,000 for up to 2-year projects. So then briefly, the Leverhulme Research Project Grant based from the UK, that's very open in terms of discipline, but it's just very similar. You can have international co-applicants, but won't allow salary costs. So then this call I just included, it's actually more of a parallel project funding call. It's not explicitly cross-border. I just included it. It has recently closed, but I guess it'd be great if it reopened, if it ran again next year. It seemed very related to nations of town research areas funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council, and it's a funds collaborative knowledge exchange projects on the theme of place. So I think there's different ways to pursue research funding, and you can definitely try and do apply for cross-border research funding, where it's explicitly funding a project with researchers on both sides. But another approach is a kind of parallel funding approach, where you identify shared interests across the two institutions, but that when opportunities come up in each place that maybe don't explicitly fund a cross-border or an international element, NBRIM might identify a research project and try and get funding on one side, and at the same time, the Irish participants could try and get funding for an Irish project that could kind of go in parallel to that. So it's just different ways of approaching it, but I think something like this project did seem like very relevant to Nations of Towns. So then Horizon Europe, I mostly looked at, so the Horizon Europe is divided into clusters, and there's 6 clusters. So the cluster that seemed most relevant was cluster 6, which is all about kind of environment, natural resources, and communities. So one of the destinations, which is one of the sort of subgroups within cluster 6, is about resilient and inclusive communities. So there weren't a huge number of calls that jumped out at me, but I would need to do a bit more digging within the program, as it's pretty vast. There did seem to be a couple of options that are currently open, but again, these are closing in the early part of 2022, so they're probably not relevant for the moment. Along with some of those calls within that cluster, there are topics that would be associated with the new European Bauhaus, which Orla Murphy is involved with. And the new European Bauhaus was it's kind of launched by President von der Leyen in 2020, and it's about bringing the European Green Deal to life, and it's very much connected to architecture and design. So there are topics that are connected to that. There's one that's open at the moment about very much connected to architecture and design and the arts and creating inclusive societies. So I would say Horizon Europe has definitely got potential as long as everything goes okay with the negotiations and getting the contract signed off. Because obviously the UK can participate in that case. But I think at this stage, probably easiest to think about or maybe plan think about joining consortium, research consortium, rather than initiating a project as a coordinator at this stage, because they are big multi-million euro projects, and they, like you can see here, they usually have a very specific remit. So it can be a little bit hard to plan for, and I suppose the best thing in terms of planning can be to think about your partners in Europe and try and build relationships with partners in Europe, with potential partner universities and other organizations that might fit within that, with the scope of what you want to do. And then you're kind of ready for call topics as they're announced. And so there's different ways to do this, but also there are networking opportunities that are organized by the Commission. So that's just something to bear in mind that we might look at again at some of the future meetings. So then we'll just move on to network funding. So this is kind of funding for activities that are not directly to fund research costs, but they fund grants that will fund the setting up or establishment of networks. So probably the most famous network mechanism in Europe is the COST scheme, cost action grants. But would say probably the easiest way to benefit from a cost action grants is to join an existing action, because I think they can be quite challenging to run. The money that you get it's not a huge amount. You get about 129,000 for a 4-year project, but there has to be at least 7 partner countries involved, partner organizations. So it would fund things like summer schools, training schools, when it's for scientific, it would fund lab visits, but it can fund all kind of like collaborative exchanges. I think it's a really good scheme, and I did have a look at some of the to see whether there were any existing cost actions that are related to towns, and there doesn't seem to be. So that would indicate that there's possibly a gap there. But again, like with Horizon Europe, I think it would be about a long-term game of building up your connections across Europe and working out collaboratively a kind of focus area for the action, and then building an application sort of with a year and a half or 2 years kind of notice. And then beyond cost, we have the Arts and Humanities Research Council have a networking call as well, which is funds up to, I think it's up to 45,000 if you're including costs of bringing in international participants. It does explicitly mention international collaboration. So again, it would be funding events, any kind of networking activities that you could kind of come up with. So then I'm nearly finished. So the early career researcher, we we've talked about this a lot in the Centre for Irish Towns, and I think it's just to mention it as a kind of something to bear in mind for a longer term strategy of building up a research agenda. I think so in the Centre for Irish Towns this year, we ran a kind of recruitment campaign to find interested PhD students and then support them with their applications to the Irish Research Council funding scheme, so the PhD funding scheme. And I think it's similar to that kind of parallel approach. You could try and generate interest among PhD or postdoc applicants in the Nations of Town projects, and then kind of offer support or mentorship and try and build a community of early career researchers in each location. So, and if you did that, then you would be able to build kind of mechanisms to connect students and postdocs to both institutions and workshops and things like that. So I'm less familiar with the UK process for these applications. I think a lot of the time it's done through universities rather than through funding agencies. In Ireland, it's done primarily through the Irish Research Council because it's the main funder, definitely for PhDs. And I just briefly would mention the Mary Skidelsky Curie, the European fellowships. They are all about funding mobility. So you have to have an outgoing host and a return host. So you've basically got two institutions that host the first part and then the second part of your project. So that could be, if you could find, it's a little bit tricky in terms of eligibility, but if you could find the right candidate who match the eligibility criteria, that could potentially be a linking project between the two institutions. Well, I think I actually missed a slide. Oh yeah, so briefly on the network funding, there are a couple of other smaller network funding grants through the Royal Society of Edinburgh, and there was one that ran last year, which was ESRC and the Irish Research Council. Again, it was kind of a UK Ireland networking grant. So again, there are network grants, as I said already, and they're just something to bear in mind depending on what activities you wanted to pursue. So we talked about PhD and postdoc funding. So this is my last slide. I just wanted to flag that there are internal funding opportunities. The University of Edinburgh certainly has the Challenge Investment funding and possibly some other types of funding. We didn't get a chance to quite check that out in full detail. The Earth Institute has a strategic priority funding mechanism that funds projects of up to 10,000. And again, it's not for research, it's more about capacity building. And the Centre for Irish Towns was one of the projects that emerged from that scheme. And the deadline for that is in June. So that's for smaller scale kind of ideas, that there could be something there. And then in terms of, there are other, beyond research funding, there are other types of funding. I didn't get into these too much, it's kind of outside my area of expertise, but there were a couple of a couple of opportunities mentioned by Anna and Ian. So there's the National Lottery funding. Again, it would need a strong community focus. It probably won't fund international elements, but again, it could be part of that parallel approach. Likewise with Scotland Loves Local, and in Ireland there's been a couple of schemes. There's one live at the moment and one that's recently closed that might reopen, looking very much at communities and climate action. So those would be just some examples of community-oriented funding. I think there are probably lots more and other schemes that I haven't probably included. So that's basically all for me. I'm sorry I probably bombarded you all with lots of information. So if you'd like, we will circulate the slides, or they'll be available afterwards. And if anybody has any questions or comments or suggestions for calls or schemes that I might have missed, please tell me.
Great, thanks, Caitriona. Do you want